Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. We are ready for the next panel discussion, and we're joined, as promised, by Professor Baden. Actually, the panel will be building upon some of Professor Baden's ideas, the ideas he talked about earlier today, and at the same time, there will be experts from other fields around the table as well. The panel will be looking at cities and at society at large in times of global climate change. And immediately several questions come to mind, like how does climate change affect cities? And also, how can cities and life in cities adapt to anticipate on life in changing circumstances? It's something I think we're all very aware of, that is happening. Wherein also lie the threats, but also perhaps the opportunities to build, live, organize, breathe, and be in cities in a sustainable way. Sustainable, one of the values of this new European Bauhaus Festival, as you well know. Those are some of the questions that will be addressed by our next panel, introduced to you in a moment and moderated by Niklas Maak, Professor of Architecture at the Stedel Institute of Fine Arts in Frankfurt, also in Harvard, and Culture and Arts Editor of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in Germany. Dr. Maak, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Hello, good evening. I'm very thrilled and happy and honored to be here in Brussels tonight and to present you a wonderful panel of 4 people, 3 live here, 1 on screen from Rome. 4 people who, if you want to look for solutions for the future of the city, I think we cannot imagine any better panel. So I'm very happy to be here with you, and let me quickly introduce our guests in alphabetical order. We start with Markus Bader, to my right. He studied architecture in London and in Berlin, but he is much more than an architect. He founded a practice called Raumlabor in Berlin with many friends. And Raumlabor is not an architectural office. It is a collective that has created a totally new form of production of something that is more than architecture, that is something we could call urban practice, or the creation of new social spaces which are sustainable not only in an ecological but also in a social way. So I'm very happy to have him here and talk especially about 2 projects that have become almost worldwide known, because he is also the winner of the Golden Lion of the Architectural Biennial in Venice for a project called the Floating University. And already the name indicates that we have here something which is floating, reacting to a situation of precarity in times of climate change, but it's also a university. And not only a university as you know it, but a new typology of university built in Berlin next to the airport of Tempelhof. So I'm very happy to talk with him about this project in a minute. But we have another guest here to his right, your left, Shigeru Ban, who I don't have to introduce because A, he was on stage an hour ago, and B, he is a famous architect and forerunner of what we could call an ecological movement in architecture. Already at the time when others were still using tons of concrete and glass to build high-rise towers, he surprised the world with architecture built from paper. And I remember going to Hanover in the year 2000. I was blown away by an architecture that you saw and you couldn't believe that it could stand. It was basically completely made from cardboard and tubes. A wonderful example. Some people here know, of course, his Centre Pompidou in Metz. Shigeru studied architecture in California, in New York, worked with Isozaki, and then founded his office in 1985, and immediately got involved in a discourse that can be seen in retrospect as one of the most groundbreaking changes, paradigmatic changes in how we not only produce architecture, but how we produce space also in times of crisis. We had a little possibility to listen to his presentation an hour ago about what he did in the context of architecture for refugees in moments of crisis, and I'm very happy to talk on this topic of the city of the future in times of global crisis with him in a minute. Also, of course, I'm happy to talk about the connection of the ecological question and the social question with you, because I think your architecture has responses to both of these questions. We have, from Uganda, Hilda Flavia Nakabuye, who is not an architect, but a civil rights activist, a climate activist, and the founder of Fridays for Future Uganda. And I'm especially happy that you are with us today, because if we talk about Europe and the global crisis and global climate change, of course, we have to talk about the connection Europe has with countries in Africa. And as you know, of course, in Belgium, in Germany, we have a very violent colonial history with African countries, and I think it's an urgency to discuss in a very critical way new forms of cooperation and collaboration in a time where extractive practices and economic developments, which are still exploitative, are still happening, and where we have to come up with a new narrative of how we could shape a future cohabitation between African and European countries. So I'm very happy to have you here and talk about your work. Welcome. And last but not least, we have Hans-Joachim, or internationally known as John Schellenhuber, who is a climatologist, a theoretical physicist, that's what he studied, and of course, worldwide known as a founding director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. This institute alone, we could talk for 3 hours about it. It has changed the way we talk about the city, how we talk about the planet, how we prove that there is climate change. Because when John started his work, most people thought that climate change might happen, might not happen, might not be so urgent. And he was basically the first person who proved and developed theories with his team that show how urgent this topic is. He worked for a long time at the Potsdam Institute. He only recently, and I'm happy to discuss that with you, John, he only recently discovered the role of architecture, and he founded something which is called the Bauhaus der Erde. This is not to be confounded with the new European Bauhaus. So there is almost a wave of Bauhauses coming up, and I'm very happy to talk with him about what the Bauhaus der Erde is and how it is to be distinguished from the new European Bauhaus. He also comes from a little village, he often told, near Passau, where you have a long tradition of wooden houses. So I'm also happy to talk with him and the experts for architecture with sustainable material, also about that heritage. I want to start this evening, this hour that we have, with a presentation, again in alphabetical order, because we couldn't decide whom to ask first as a speaker. So again, alphabetical order. I'm very happy to ask Markus Bader to talk a little bit about the project that won the Golden Lion in Venice, and to talk about another project which I personally love a lot. It's called Haus der Statistik, and it is a concrete monster, an old ministry in the middle of Berlin that was supposed to be torn down. And then luckily there was an initiative to say, in times of climate crisis, we cannot take down something. And Shigeru said this an hour ago. You cannot just, as a developer, go into the city, take down a building and build a new building. We have to think about more intelligent, more responsible, and also more creative ways to deal with the structures we find and to reshape them. And Markus has a fantastic project in Berlin, Haus der Statistik. So Markus, the stage is yours for some minutes, and I'm happy to see your presentation with you and discuss it with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Niklas, for this kind introduction. Yes, I think there is a couple of slides. They should be running autonomously, so you have to bear with me while I talk sort of slightly on top of that. The two projects that I'm bringing that were also already introduced, I would call them not only projects, but rather suggest the term urban transformation laboratories somehow. And why am I interested in this term, or urban practice as another term? I think both projects show very well that it is possible to enter complex territories with complex questions and to, in order through acting together and through building them together, find ways to inhabit these complexities. And for me, this is super interesting because coming from planning, there is always an idea of simplification, of abstraction, and of normatization. And we live in a moment of society where we want to come beyond that, where we're interested in accepting the difference and to create environments that accommodate and welcome difference rather than normatize and standardize. So the first project, and this is a very nice image to show now, is Haus der Statistik. As introduced, it was sort of an as-found building, derelict and empty as an office building centrally located in Berlin, just off Alexanderplatz. And this building was discovered, more or less, by a group of artists and activists in 2015, claiming this was the moment of the so-called refugee crisis, when many new people arrived in Berlin, and the question for space became a new sort of urgency. And this moment, the artistic and activist community suggested that this building could be a place for arts and culture and education, and also for people coming with a migrational interest. Interesting enough, the politics side of Berlin picked up, and very quickly a sort of process unfolded that has a couple of milestones. I would say the first milestone was that the mayor of the district got in touch with the activists and said, this is actually a good idea, let's transform this building. The second milestone of this process was that the building was still in, let's say, a complex ownership situation. The Land of Berlin acquired the building and is now it's in public ownership, so it can be discussed on a local level how to develop the building. And the third milestone is that there was a very special, and this is kind of model anew, a very special cooperation agreement was signed between the city, the district, the Berlin's housing company, and the Berlin's real estate management company, together with the civic society as the fifth partner called Co-op 5, to develop this site and this derelict building on eye level together without sort of outvoting any of the partners. This has not been done like that before in Berlin, and it's really this new model of a civic-public partnership that is taking place here. What I think is also special is that as soon as this process started, we suggested that we don't want to plan it top-down, but we want to learn from the site itself through inhabitation and through use, and through making the place together during the phase of use, discover the potentials and the interests also of the civic society and the city that is there today. What happens in this kind of processes is that you start with, we want a space for arts, culture, education, and affordable living. And as soon as the activities start, they become illustrated or they become adopted, and they start to transform. So now we have an interest group around recycling, reuse, and the question of materiality and resources in society, where people from the arts mix with many other people and with different backgrounds. We have a group organized around food questions, around the countryside-city relationship, and so on. But also a theater group and people talking about educational questions, as you can see here. So I think the point is, if we enter these complex situations in a collaborative mode, we have a lot of negotiations to do, but we also discover during the phase of use and through the difficulty of these negotiations, another potential future than if we would just sit in our offices and draw it top down. Which brings me to the second example. Sorry, I have to turn around because these screens are a little bit light. The second example is called floating university. And my colleague likes to say it's not floating and it's not a university, introducing this question of a contradiction in itself. But what is it? You saw some diagrams about the evolution of the place. I think and there's many stories that can be told. One is the story of the hardware, and it's a sort of discovery in the middle of the city off Tempelhof Airfield, a very beautiful spot of a thing that is, described to the end for our administrational perspective as a rainwater retention basin of the airport. So whenever it rains and the sort of concrete surfaces of the airport collect water, it is collected here and then slowly diffused into the canal. That's the technical functionality. And for, I don't know, maybe 70 or 80 or more years, this is what this place did. Apart from doing this, the place has become a place that is inhabited by endangered species, by amphibia. Also, this reed island that you can see there in some of the pictures started to grow because it wasn't cleaned as properly as before. And suddenly, this place that is a technical infrastructure also is a place for biodiversity, for basically nature, if we want to use that term in a post-Anthropocene moment, where nature is coming back and helping us sort of to clean the polluted waters that are coming from the street surface. And this amazing sort of double layer a third layer has been added, which is humans come in. And these humans are interested in cohabitation, in being friends with the technical infrastructure, but also with the amphibia, and to inhabit what I like to call this contaminated paradise. Because in fact, the water collecting all the kind of surface rub-offs from the tires and so on, from the nearby street, in fact, you should not really want bath in it. So we have this situation that it looks like a fantastic dream place, but we know rationally that it's not. And for us, this is such a beautiful and also hard metaphor, or let's say an inhabitable kind of place where the contradictions of humanity in living with the planet today can be felt and can be dealt with in some way.
So it's really also an interesting example if we talk about cohabitation. That cohabitation, of course, doesn't only mean a cohabitation among humans, but also cohabitation with other species and plants that help you actually dwell in a more sustainable way. A beautiful project, by the way. You see this image on the left. There is a Japanese building that was not done by you. How did the Japanese building migrate into that structure? And did you learn something from that Japanese building inside your structure?
Yeah, exactly. This is, it's not in the image anymore. It's Atelier Bauau, and it's called the Urban Forest. It was part of the exhibition Die Wohnungsfrage, the housing question. And it was invented and set up as a sort of one-to-one model that can be used. And this is actually its third appearance. The first one was in the museum context. The second was also co-organized by my colleague Benny to have it rebuilt in Tempelhof Airport as a kids' play structure. And this is the third one.
It's maybe interesting to know that this structure is also reusing other architectures in different ways. If we look at it, it looks very beautiful and very simple, and you think it looks so convincing that you think it has been always there. But of course, it's very hard, and this brings us, we're here in Brussels, in the epicenter of bureaucracy, and it brings us to a very important question, because when we see these things, we think it's beautiful. We want to live like that. We want to try out these forms. Shigeru has, in his previous talk, already mentioned it's not very easy to convince the authorities, the commissioner, to build a house in paper because people think it can burn. It's also maybe not very easy to convince the authorities to build something in a water basin like that. So if you had a wish when it comes to make these things more easy, and hopefully we have a lot of politicians listening to us, what would be your wish as an architect to be able to realize these fantastic ideas you have quicker and more efficiently? Because I think we all agree that these are beautiful experiments, but then we ask ourselves, why are there so little? And why don't we see many more paper tube houses all over the world done by Shigeru, and more projects like the floating university? And there must be a reason, and my fear is that this lays in the legal framework. So can you say a word before I open the discussion to the rest of the team to the question, what is preventing us from doing much more things like that in the time that we still have, because climate change isn't waiting for laws to change on slow pace?
Well, I would like to bring in the term risk, and maybe most of these projects are done under the umbrella of that it's art. And when it's art, that's one of the segments of society where there's still a certain freedom to do things that are not yet fully tested. And I think I'm suggesting, and we're working with Berlin Politics on this, to introduce something like a department for urban practice, so that this kind of thinking of let's enter an open-ended process of collaborative reinvention of a place also has sort of stakeholders on the administrative side.
Yeah. So this is also for those who are architects among you here. It's a very good tip. Maybe if you can't get a permit for an experimental building, you can try to frame it as art, as the performance stage, and actually there are some examples where that helps. Shigeru, have you ever been tempted to say, I can't sell it and build it as architecture, I declare it a piece of art and push it through differently? Or what were your struggles with law?
Actually, we have been facing a similar problem, I think. So you said that this is art. I always said this is temporary, because nobody believes that building can be permanent with paper. But from my experience, it's much easier to get the permission, okay, if we say this is temporary, and this is temporary looking. But as I showed before, when the building loved by people and become the symbol of the city, people like to keep it, and this become permanent. And then maybe we can get permission later, because even for temporary building, I meet the local regulations, so that there's no difference between temporary and permanent. So I work with engineer. So that was a similar strategy. So this is art. I said this is just a temporary.
Yeah.
So,
but as somebody who has a background in Japanese architecture, but who has worked in America and Europe, would you say that the European legislation is especially hard and bureaucratic when it comes to realizing?
Actually, I don't study architecture. I didn't study architecture in Japan, so I didn't know the situation. That's why I could do it, because I didn't know what we are not supposed to do. But anyway, Japan has a more difficult regulation for fire and structure. So actually, there are more examples of a permanent paper building in Europe or other cities than Japan. So bureaucratic things is more difficult in Japan.
Because I think it's a very important topic that if we talk about sustainable material often is material that burns easily. And if you work
that's a prejudice, because wood can be burned also.
Yeah.
But the paper tube is industrial material. You can make fire protected very easily, because we have a standard fire protected wallpaper. So paper is industrial material.
Yeah.
That's why it's easy to waterproof and easy to fire protected.
Yeah. I would also ask the question to John Schellenhuber, who is with us in Rome, who is at the same time a scientist and somebody who is very active in politics now in Europe. John, would you say it's more important, firstly, to change the legal framework of what we can do with materials like wood and paper before we actually start about thinking of what we can build? Or where do you think is the biggest obstacle? You are somebody who discovered, as you wrote in a beautiful text in Frankfurter Allgemeine, very lately, the role of architecture in climate change, you said it was the elephant in the room that you didn't see for a long time, and then you discovered that like 40% of greenhouse gases are connected to the built world, and you are now one of the most prominent defenders and propagators of building with wood. But of course, there are many legal problems. So what do you think is the most urgent thing we should do if we really want to come up with what the Germans call a Bauwende, a change in the building policy?
Okay, first of all, can you hear me, Niklas?
We hear you very well, and we see you at monumental scale.
Excellent. Because I'm in the parallel Bauhaus universe here in Rome. We are doing a conference at the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. In the Vatican, we had Ursula von der Leyen as a keynote speaker this morning, Francisca Rey and Shigeru. Hello, Shigeru. He will join us tomorrow, actually. So this is a world of distributed places connected by the internet. In a way, this is a metaphor for the future. On your question, when I realized some 10 years ago that the climate equation can only be solved if we transform the built environment, which is producing the bulk of the greenhouse gas emissions, for example, when I tried to develop a narrative how if we give up conventional architecture and turn to nature-based solutions, in particular nature-based renewable materials, then we actually can not only reduce emissions, but we can even undo historical emissions, because, you know, if a tree grows and by photosynthesis, it's sucking up CO2, it's the fruit in the atmosphere. And if you turn this wood into a long-lasting product, in particular into buildings, then you have extracted CO2 from the atmosphere. So we can make up, actually undo historical emissions. So when I started to think more about it and discussed it, and I encountered a number of companies working with timber, for example, small and medium-sized enterprises, I heard them complaining all the time about the bureaucracy, as we just discussed. So the fire regulations, the earthquake regulations, what have you. And they complained that they often couldn't realize their projects because even the lowest level of bureaucracy was like a concrete wall where we ran against them. But when I discovered that these companies, these people, these organizations are highly fragmented, and what they lacked was a common narrative, so to speak. And the narrative here comes from climate science because, and this is, I'm really serious about it, if we do not change the way we build cities, buildings, infrastructures globally, we will go far beyond the 2 degrees warming, which we consider, scientists, the critical line. Beyond that, if we go to 3, 4 degrees, human civilization as we know it will cease to exist. I'm absolutely serious about that. So, but if instead...
As a question to you as a scientist, we have a strange paradox in the world of architecture. At the one hand, we know that we should better not build too much to protect the environment. At the same time, there is still an influx of millions and millions of people in the big cities of the world, and according to UN statistics, up to 1 billion apartments would have to be built in the next 30 years if we don't change that situation. So how do you deal as a scientist and as somebody who's recently started to get very involved with architecture, how do you solve that paradox of a necessity to not build so much, especially not with concrete and glass, and the necessity to house all the people who come to the cities? Or do you think this assumption by the UN is false?
No, I will come back actually to your first question, which I haven't answered yet. But before I go to your second question, I mean, there's no contradiction here. If you have a building stock which is in principle functional, like we have in Europe, of course you should retrofit it, you should make it climate neutral, climate friendly, whatever. That's okay. But 80% of the buildings we need, for example, in Africa, for the growing population there, that's not built yet. And now comes the beautiful story. If you build them from timber, for example, from bamboo and other, you will not only be climate neutral, you will be climate positive. Because the more you build, the more walls you build from massive timber, for example, the more you suck up carbon from the atmosphere. Of course, you need sustainable forestry to deliver this biomass to be harvested. But you see, the more you build, the more you extract CO2 from the atmosphere. And that's what most people just don't get. Now, I'm trying to communicate that to the world and to the Commission and to the United Nations, and it's slowly sinking into the debate. And here is my narrative, so to speak. With this narrative, that the biggest perpetrator of climate change, namely the built environment, can be turned into a saint, if you like, into a savior of the global climate system, then of course you have a powerful story to tell. And this is the story we are offering the Bauhaus Theater and so on to all the people who try to overcome this obsolete conventional way of building with steel and concrete and glass and aluminium and plastics and so on. And so my answer to your first question is, if we are able to spread the word, communicate a powerful story, then of course we will be able also to change regulations. But what I learned from all these concrete project developers is they run against the lowest level of bureaucracy and they cannot convince them, of course. So it has to come top down, really. So that's what I suggested also to Ursula von der Leyen, to the Commission, that Brussels, that the European Union is starting a reform debate across Europe, how regulations have to be further developed in order to allow to build climate friendly. But in the end, you need a very good story to tell, and I think we found the perfect story here.
So part of the good story that John Schellenhuber is asking us and you to create is, of course, a narrative that is not restricted to building, that is not restricted also to Europe. And this brings me to our other panelists here. I'm very happy to have you on the panel because you are a climate activist, and I think it's essential to discuss also the effects that especially European policies have had in the past, but still have in our present when we discuss the future of the city, because the future of the city, of course, is also the future of the cities in Uganda. Many African countries have an exploding population, have the highest birth rates, and so there are many urbanistic and town planner questions coming up in the forthcoming years. During my travels in Africa, I have seen many leapfrog inventions in countries like Uganda, Rwanda, Kenya, where Europeans can actually learn a lot from in terms of how technology is used to better processes of farming, of how technology is used in terms of running cities differently. But maybe you want to talk a little bit about your how you got to become a climate activist in Uganda, and how you see the role of Europe, of also Europe's economic activities and economic activities of European and international companies in Uganda, because I think that is a big part of your work to basically create a critical knowledge about what is happening in Uganda in these days.
Okay, thank you so much for that question. I come from Uganda, a country that is very vulnerable to the impact of climate change. Uganda is located in the Horn of Africa, and Africa as a continent emits barely 4% of the global greenhouse emission. And my country, Uganda, is the 12th most vulnerable country in the world to climate change, and also the 49th country least prepared to combat its effects In Uganda, I live in the capital called Kampala, which was designed by the colonial government to serve their interests in the 19th century. And it is one of the poorly planned cities in the world, as it cannot even stand 30 minutes of rain. In Kampala, rain means a bad day due to the so-called bad weather. Rain in Kampala is worse than snow in Brussels. Almost everything gets paralyzed. You cannot move from one place to the other. Some people remain in their beds, traffic gets crazy, children find it difficult to go to school, and transport fares are increased. Flooding washes away people's beddings, among others. Kampala is a dumping ground for all the unwanted vehicles, clothes, and many more harmful products from developed countries like in the global north. Most parts of Kampala are not livable, even for children. All this rainwater carrying waste ends up in our resources, in water resources, lakes, rivers. I lead a lake cleanup on Africa's largest lake, which is Lake Victoria, which is a source of livelihoods for over 40 million people. I do this to beat plastic pollution, but also to preserve and protect our water bodies. Research says that this lake will be no more in 100 years, and we don't want that to happen. So my love for nature got me up to mobilize my fellow students, and we started Fridays for Future Uganda. It's a youth organization that demands climate justice. So this organization became a voice of the voiceless, and up to date, the organization has grown into Uganda's leading youth climate organization, which has inspired many on the African continent. More than 7 million people, about twice the size of the greater Kampala population, die annually due to air pollution. And air pollution is estimated to be more deadly in Africa than malnutrition and unsafe sanitation. Monitoring is the first step towards pollution management, but access to this information of air quality data is a major challenge for Africa and for the global south, largely because of the prohibitive costs of air quality monitoring. According to the latest UN report, cities consume 78% of the world's energy and produce more than 60% of the greenhouse gas emissions. Moreover, residents of just 100 cities account for 20% of humanity's overall carbon footprint. From transportation to construction to food waste, no other entity emits as many greenhouse gases as the cities. So as the most densely populated settlements have had the most experience in grappling with addressing these social and environmental inequalities, they are also the best equipped to offer models on how to promote justice and equity by stopping current, preventing future, and repairing holistic oppression on front lines and vulnerable communities. Part of my work is the East African Crude Oil Pipeline. This is the pipeline that is operated by an European company, the Total Energies, which is a French company. This pipeline, if it's built, will be the world's longest heated crude oil pipeline. It will be 1,445 kilometers long. It will come from my country, Uganda, through Tanzania and to the port of Tanga. This pipeline has displaced over 100,000 people, households. Over 400 villages have been displaced. Our sources of income and livelihoods are at risk. I'm about to lose my village if this pipeline goes through. But these multinational companies keep doing the same to African countries, even when Africans do not really benefit from these economic activities. They say that Africans will develop, but we are not a continent that can develop with oil or coal or gas. We are an agriculture economy, and we depend on that for our livelihoods, and that is how it has been for years. This is our lineage. This is our culture and tradition. We are farmers, and we depend on that for our living. We cannot survive with oil or coal being produced. So we need more investments in agriculture, in green energy, in renewable energy that will develop our countries and cities, but not in fossil fuels.
I'm curious, Hilda, to hear if in your work as an activist who wants to prevent also European companies from destroying the country, from doing very unsustainable developments in Africa, have you encountered any help by European politicians, by the European Union? Is there any contact person in Kampala where you could address with these problems and say, we want to work with you on a different narrative together with Europe, or would that still have to be founded?
That will still have to be founded, but at the moment we work with over 100 civil society organizations that are around the world. And for the last 2 months, I came to Europe to create awareness about the East African crude oil pipeline, and also to ask people of Europe to support us in creating awareness, but also asking the governments to stop funding, to ask financial banks and insurers to stop supporting the construction of the East African crude oil pipeline, because most of the insurers and the banks that are into this activity are in Europe. So we together with other civil society organizations had this work done.
Yeah, maybe we can pass the question to John Schellenhuber in Rome, who beautifully calls his project Bauhaus der Erde, which means Bauhaus of the earth, double meaning as the earth in the sense of material, but also as the globe. Could you imagine, or are there projects to support initiatives like Hilda's as part of an urban investment, or an investment in the urban future of not only European countries, but what Edouard Glissant, the philosopher, called so beautifully the mundanité of the built environment?
Okay, there is some noise in the background because Ursula von der Leyen was just in the restaurant where we will have dinner. So it's interesting. Actually, yes, I think Europe should have a much closer look at our big neighbor continent, Africa. I think the future in the global south anyway, but in particular what is going to happen in Africa. And I try to encourage the European Commission actually to strike, if you like, a new deal with Africa to be completely different agriculture, learning from African context, but also providing opportunities for leapfrogging actually a number of developments that go completely wrong. So, I mean, just think of what will be the most populated cities in the middle of the century. The projections are will be Kinshasa, it will be Dar es Salaam, it will be Lagos, so all sitting in Africa, for example. So the future of the planet will be decided mostly in Africa, a little bit in Asia, a little bit in Latin America. So it is in the interest, on the one hand, of Europe to help and to develop in a sustainable way. But I think it's also our damn responsibility to provide opportunities and to help them actually create a lab of new ideas, actually, and support everything.
John, we cannot hear you very well. Maybe, maybe sound engineer can get your voice a bit louder. In the meantime, I want to ask Shigeru, because there is almost a tradition in your office, in your work, of working in many places affected by climate change. So how did you set up that project, which is not a one-time project, but almost wherever there is need of improvised architecture, temporary architecture, you show up. That was the case in many disaster sites. So I think it's important also when we discuss these ideas of how the European Union could expand their appetite from the European political borders into the world and really create something meaningful to fight global climate change on a global level. I think they can learn a lot from your endeavors. So maybe you can talk a little bit of how you set up this system of helping all over the world.
so I'm sorry, how to pronounce your name? Heidi? Hilda. Hilda. Because I have been to Uganda when I was working for Rwanda refugees, and Kampala was a really beautiful place. And also, I found out in Africa, in many of the area, used to have a bamboo forest. But when end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century, when European people colonized Africa, because the European people doesn't know how wonderful bamboo is, how to use bamboo traditionally. That's why they cut the forest all and put the falling trees. So that's create a new problem. The people think that the panda in China is only gorilla who eat the bamboo, but it's not true. The African mountain gorilla used to eat bamboo because there was bamboo forest. I think that Europe should help to plant bamboo like before, because bamboo can be good building material. Also, you can make any craft weaving, and still some of the people in Eastern Africa, they use bamboo for the liquor. So there are so many ways to use bamboo. I think that this can be your responsibility as a European people who colonize and cut all the forests of the bamboo, bringing back bamboo for new building and for many other technologies. I think, what do you think about this?
I think it would be a good thing if bamboo is really planted, because we need to treasure what we have. We only treasure when it's gone, but if it's there, we don't see its purpose. But this is it's bringing back the traditions that were there, and I think this needs to be restored in many countries.
Yeah. I also wanted to ask Marcus, who founded at least a university, which is more than a university, if there are plans or appetites at Raumlabor to expand the floating university into a really international system and trans-European system of interventions and floating universities also beyond the European borders. Because, of course, you're very well known in Europe, but I think things like that and architectural practices like that could also work in a context that Hilda just described, in Kampala, in Goma. Are there attempts in your office or your collective to collaborate?
Yeah, I think the first answer is very simple. The floating is already a place where many people from diverse backgrounds meet. And I think this is one of the big qualities of floating, that it's I would call it its openness. And the very careful design of the place that once you entered, you like to stay. We were discussing about how to synchronize the programs that they fit better, but in the end we decided that if there is collisions and frictions, it's actually more interesting. And there is already university people, but also people that don't have a degree or don't come from an institutional background, that are meeting and floating and discuss on eye level. For example, Kids University exists as well. The question about transferability of this kind of practice is also an interesting one. We had a very friendly conversation with architects from South Africa at some moment that were coming to Raumlabor with a tour organized by Goethe Institute. And I think you have to be very precise about how to work in which context. Yeah. Our friends from over there were quite surprised that Goethe shows them how Raumlabor introduces this idea of informality to a context which maybe is over-formalized, a practice that they said in their environment is very, very common. So maybe it's not only about, again, exporting this kind of practices, but rather creating a mutual exchange between people on the globe about what are actually sustainable practices of spatial production, but also of exchanging and learning.
You said sustainable. This is one of the most used words on every panel in the future. And the second most used word in the European context is the smart city. And that is a concept that we encounter still in European discussions about the future of the city. It's funded with millions of euros. Whenever you say this is becoming a smart city, you still get a lot of money in Europe. And I want to hear your thoughts about it. What makes the city really smart? What are also, to your view, maybe the detrimental effects of a tech solutionist concept of the smart city that in the end maybe just it consists of putting electric cars instead of combustion engine cars, but it's still cars. And so my question is maybe the smart city as we frame it now a dead end, and should there be another form of smartness? Maybe, Shigeru, you want to say something about the smart city obsession of Europeans and other continents?
Well, even in Japan, everyone and also government start talking about creating a smart city. But the smart city cannot be created without creating new employment and industry in other many smaller cities, not just bringing IT digital technology to somewhere. So important thing is that creating the new employment locally, depending on what is really available locally, instead of having these IT solutions. But that's my opinion.
Marcus, Tilda, any thoughts about what makes the city really smart?
Well, I think on one hand, we're in the middle of this of the radical transformation towards a digital society. On the other hand, I'm very, very fascinated by the notion of the material reality, and whatever way we agree to manage this material reality, it stays the same. So for me, for example, the terminology of the critical zone brought up by Bruno Latour and others creates a very, very clear image that even this idea of extractivism has limits. That with the critical zone, he describes the very few kilometers of life that are actually surrounding our planet. And if you scale out onto the planetary scale, I think it's an incredibly strong image that we are this kind of smear on the top of this rock that shoots through space. And we're actually not extracting anything from the planet and bring it out in a large scale, but all we do is we shuffle things around and we sort of change the mix. But the way we do this, we're actually approaching a scale of change that is becoming toxic. So this kind of little smear of a complex environment is more or less killed off by humanity and its actions. So whenever the smartness that is needed will help us to support the smear, I'm a total fan of that. But at the moment, I think it's much more interesting to be aware that every kind of transformation that we talk about is a transformation within an extremely limited system. And again, the fantasy of smartness, also the fantasy of the smartphone, for me is always built on a sort of fiction of, let's say, we can disconnect from this very grounding reality of a material reality.
Yeah, maybe also Hilda, I think when we look at how people live in Uganda, but also in Kenya, we find that the European distinction between city life and countryside life is more complex in these countries, and that people can be city dwellers and they can live in Kampala and still consider themselves as people who have their roots in the countryside, who go regularly to the countryside. Maybe you can say a word about the challenge that poses, because my impression was that, of course, the question of traffic between the city and the countryside, about going back and forth, is an essential question when we talk about the city of the future and climate change. And in Europe, there are all these concepts about the 50-minute city, that you should bring work and life together in a way that you don't have to take your car for half an hour to go somewhere. But I felt that, especially in Uganda, there are ideas to reframe the whole idea of the relation of the countryside life and the city life in an interesting way. Maybe you can say a word about that.
Well, in Uganda, East Africa, it's a bit different. When we say smart cities, this is a life we've never imagined. Most of us grew up from grass-thatched houses, and many of us still do. The idea of having houses built with cement and glass is something that we see in European countries. It's not something that is everywhere in Africa or in my country, for example. And this is the life we dream of. And if we hear that Europe is dreaming of something even bigger, we see and think that when will we reach there? But this is a life that is not sustainable. We are used to living in a sustainable environment, sustainable world, sustainable households. And having cities constructed, well-paved roads is more of, I should say, a picture that the government or people or investors continue to shed, but is very far away from what we see. And to me, a smart city is one that is designed, its buildings are designed to have net zero energy standards, and one where the emissions are limited, that we have a chance to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius amidst other things. But what is happening in Africa is many of the people in the town or in the village are, we treasure our tradition and cultures, so we depend mostly on land. If one doesn't have land, then they are broke or they are poor, so they cannot afford life. And most of the land in the cities is owned by big people and very, very expensive, so many people cannot afford. So it's only those who can afford who can make their plans or even have to buy land in the city. So most of the people come to the city for work and then back to the villages or like the suburbs to rest or at home. But this will only, the thing is, if government puts out structures that could help with, first of all, reducing the traffic in the city, such as having trains or having monitored public transport means like we can see in Europe, where you can use the metro or you can use the bus that could be there anytime. If these structures are put in our cities, we could limit all the traffic, we could limit the problems of having to move to a place that is just 30 minutes away and you take about 2 hours. And yeah, if we could reform our plans or structures to the way that is more sustainable and also more accessible by many people, regardless of their tradition or where they are from.
Yeah. There is another phenomenon that I would love to discuss with all of you four experts, and that is that in the moment where we acknowledge that we should build less, there's a very interesting phenomenon that comes at hand, and that is that we witness the biggest production of ruins since antiquity in the northern part of the globe. Ruins of shopping malls, ruins of office towers, because not a revolution, but capitalism itself has extracted itself from the city, from the physical realm of the city, which doesn't mean that capitalism has vanished, of course. We still shop, but we shop online. We buy things online, and then little trucks come into the city from delivery centers that are called fulfillment centers in almost a religious way in Europe. People are encouraged by their companies to stay at home because it's cheaper for the company to keep the people at home, even if that also has, of course, disadvantages. So the interesting phenomenon is that we have still ownership in the city of buildings, but these buildings are not used the way anymore that they were supposed to be used. And so there is panic among owners of shopping malls, panic among owners of office towers. And do you think this is a chance to critically re-engage with the ruins that digitalization is currently producing? Could that be a solution? That you find a legal framework, a political framework to negotiate still with the private owners of these dysfunctional space and say, let's turn them into structures like the Haus der Statistik, or to turn them into buildings where a lot of people who just moved into the city can live in. Like, could there be your refugee architecture, Shigeru, also be in a high-rise building that was designed for a big company? Or is that too naive to think like that?
Well,
so can the ruins of capitalism and digitalization be a solution?
It's really true. Because of COVID, we found out we don't need so much office spaces. We can work differently, so that the development of the city, development of the people's living, working, we know it has to be different. So I think again, in Africa, can be one of the experimental area to have a new way of development. Because this was very interesting word told by architect Francis Kere. He's this year's Pritzker Award winner, and I attended his ceremony. He said very interesting things. Africa doesn't need to catch up with the developed country. He said we have to develop differently. So that is, I think, is very true. That you don't have to develop the cities like us, so that this can be the new experimental place or try the different way of development of city and villages.
Marcus, what is your feeling about?
Well, I would say space available is always a great potential. And part of our work is to connect available spaces with new and maybe unexpected usabilities, and basically create a kind of open dynamics around what this space could be, but also what the space could do for the city. I think Berlin was a little bit this laboratory in the center of Europe, or in one part of Europe, where the capitalist real estate market took a break after 1990, which made huge amounts of spaces available, and which I think you can look back, created an enormous amount of creativity, of alternative uses, of let's say, market-oriented uses of space, and of other ways of living together, which, of course, now with the market coming back, is under huge pressure. So I'm totally optimistic if we have spaces available, that humans can find amazing ways to reinvent their being together.
Yeah. John in Rome, what is your thinking as somebody who has the Bauhaus, the Erde, and the New European Bauhaus about the necessity of encouraging people to deal with these spaces and rebuild these spaces, but also maybe to encourage the owners of these spaces to use them differently? Can there be a legal framework and encouragement?
Okay, can you hear me again now?
Yes, we hear you perfectly well.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think for me, actually, I'm a nerve system scientist. I'm looking at the entire system. I think your question is a relevant one, but rather a marginal one. Actually, the lesson I would draw from that is refer to Shingaru here, for example. It simply shows that we have now so much space cast in stone, so to speak, in the true sense of the word. I mean, it simply means we have built the whole thing in the wrong way. If we would have built it in a decomposable way, from wood, for example, or we would do sort of a cradle-to-cradle approach to the built environment, then of course we could use the material and create new spaces, or in the course of the use of a building, it would change all the time, actually. Like in Japan, you have this traditional architecture where you change the size of the rooms and so on. I would call it fluid architecture. If you use the right material, if you use the right design principle, then actually we will not be stuck with space we don't know what to do with it, because we would adopt an evolutionary approach, actually, to architecture. That's my answer.
Thank you, John. So we already have an outline for some proposals what to do. There is the proposal to plant bamboo, where it was cut off by Europeans who thought it's just too strange of a tree to be planted there. We have John's fantastic, and I will invite you to read his proposals for a kind of circular system of wood growing and being used, and replanting and reusing it, also as a reservoir to get greenhouse gases out of the sky. But still, some things have to be built. And when I studied architecture, the first 3 years I spent building little bozzetti from concrete, that was so beautiful, and all the architects were in love with concrete. Is that love now forbidden, or would you still allow yourself to use concrete? And would you even think, under certain circumstances, we don't have to fetishize wood too much, and could concrete be a sustainable material, Shigeru-ban? Because I remember there are still buildings of yours with concrete. Is that over, or do you defend concrete?
Well,
as
now many people, engineers company is developing new kind of concrete using recyclable sand or capturing CO2 gas inside of concrete. So there is many new technology available so that concrete is not really enemy. I think we have to take advantage of all the material differently. Concrete, steel, wood, paper, it's a different material for different purposes. So the concrete is really good material, but now it's the time to move differently.
Okay. Marcus, a secret love for concrete?
Well, it's actually one of the few permanent works by Laboratories made out of concrete. It's a public sculpture on the Emcher, how do you say, pathway. Of course, I went through the same training, and I'm always wondering, now that I'm also educating in architecture, what are the questions and what are the techniques we need to transmit for a next generation? And I think, for me, the question is not a technological one, because I don't think we can sort of technologically invent our way out of this with an engineering solution. So maybe it's much more about a change of perspective and a change of culture. Mm-hmm. And I'm very fascinated by this idea, at least on a European level, by this idea of stop building, for example. A discussion that is radically changing the discipline, and of course radically challenging everything that we do in architecture when we always talk about the next house to be built. And I think it's super important that architecture students are leaving university with a sort of repertoire to deal with the existing, and also to answer the question of, let's say, a spatial need with a wider repertoire of possible answers.
Yeah. That again also a plea for a different form of education, which I think also is important when we talk about new cities in the time of global climate change, that we educate architects differently from what we did now. Europe has a very, as I said, violent and problematic and patronizing history with quote-unquote helping Africa. So, and also many concepts developed in Europe for Africa proved to be completely inefficient, as the famous fountains that were drilled somewhere because European engineers thought it's a good idea to drill it in a place where actually no one wanted them. Hilda, what would be your wish if you could define a future cooperation of your institutions, of what you do in Uganda with the European Union? What would you say would help your endeavors most in terms of support from the European Union at this point?
Thank you. This generation of youth is very creative and very demanding, but also very intelligent. When I look at the future of architecture in Uganda, we have this group of youth that use plastic to build houses, to build homes, to build toilets where in villages where they cannot even build a latrine for themselves. And they're using the plastic that comes from Europe, because our countries are taken as dumping sites for the unwanted waste. And they are using this plastic to create a home for many homeless people. And these are the creations that really need a lot of support to help youth invent even more. Imagine if youth are using the little plastic. What if they are trained? What if they are skilled? What if they are learned? Because these are people who don't even go to school, but with a little knowledge that they grow up seeing and a lot of ideas in their brains, they can do something like that. If they get educational skills, this can be a very good chance for them to even dream about becoming the next big architectures in the world, or transforming cities like we look up to. And another way is the European Union has, I should say, the power, or they can make the decisions in terms of limiting or giving power to some of their multinational companies. For example, Total Energies, if they could talk to or try to talk Total out of the East African crude oil pipeline, which I know is possible because most of Total's financial advisors are in Europe, that could be a good way. It would mean the whole world to us, because we do not want this pipeline to be constructed in our home. We prefer biodiversity, we prefer preserving our ecosystems, but not the production of oil, because we know we cannot depend on that. And we also need assistance in security, because the East African crude oil pipeline has become a threat to many lives of human rights defenders and activists who try to speak out against this project. Many people in our countries call us non-developmental. They say we are against development, but we know that development does not come from fossil fuels. We need sustainable development, and this is our future. At a time like this, when the world is looking at transitioning from fossil fuels to clean energy, we think that we deserve sustainable development and not development from fossil fuels.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that was a beautiful word to end on. The idea that we should develop a different form of development, and also see that some of the dreams of the future city in Europe, especially the smart city with all its connected tools and the Internet of Things, is of course built on an economic reality and a product reality that creates devastating effects in Africa, starting with the extraction of materials, raw materials for computers and smart products. So I think it's important to raise, as you say, the awareness that we should develop a global new idea of development, which is less efficiency driven, less tech solutionism driven, but more solidary and more inventive and more spontaneous and more global. So thank you so much to be on the stage with us here. Thank you to Jan Schellenhuber in Rome. We, of course, could go on for hours. There's so many things to discuss, but I think we got a very good impression of what you do and what you propose as solutions for the big questions to come. So thank you so much. Thank you for being here in the audience. Enjoy the evening. And if there are questions, I think we can informally discuss these questions downstairs or on the piazza. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of those who followed us on screen. And there is a big program tomorrow, and I invite you all to watch it. Good evening, and thank you again for coming here on stage.
Very nice.
Facilitation and moderation. Thank you to your panelists. It was super, very interesting. And ladies and gentlemen, we're taking a very short break, but do not run far, please, by all means. We would love to have you back here at 7:30, because our next guest is going to talk about the urban jungle. A lot has been said about the city of the future, of now, of cities all over the globe, and how they interact or don't, whether they're smart or not, whether capitalism has a future or not, in empty buildings or not. But there's more to say, in a very particular way, through the lens, among others, of plants. So I recommend that you are back here at 7:30. Professor Mancuso will be here as well, and what's more, he's open to your questions too. So interactive together, as the new European Bauhaus Festival proclaims, is what we're after. See you in a moment. Enjoy the free time, wriggle those toes and move those shoulders, get the blood flowing again, so the brain is sparked and fired up again for the next speaker in 15 minutes. Thank you.